Welcome to Rail Families United. This is going to be part 5 of the Deadly Training Materials series. Okay, so in the rail industry, there's something called PMRC. If you hear the term, well, they were PMRC'd, that stands for Procedures Monitoring for Regulatory Compliance. And so that's when you're supposed to basically have a supervisor, and I think a lot of times it's actually a manager, who is, monitoring or evaluating whether or not the work performed is being done in accordance with the law or, training programs or whatever, guidelines, whatever is in place. So in the case of conductor trainees, they're supposed to be trained and evaluated on 65 different tasks. So switching is one of the categories or tasks on which rail workers are supposed to be PMRC'd, or, you basically have to have somebody go alongside them, monitor them, see whether or not they're following regulatory requirements for how they're performing their work. So when I requested all the information pertaining to the investigation into the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney, one of the things I requested were his evaluations. I wasn't provided with copies of the 44 evaluations done by his supervisors, who would have been supervising conductors in the field. But there's a lot of issues when it comes to these evaluations. First of all, not all of them get submitted. Jason only had 44, but yet he had done 60 trips. And so a lot of times there's not an evaluation that's handed in when there's supposed to be one done for every trip. And when a conductor trainee moves on to a different supervising conductor, there is zero talking among the supervising conductors in order to help address areas of weakness, what needs a lot more work, whatever. So again, where are the safety management systems to catch that type of stuff? It's not happening. And then, let's see, if a trainee is allowed to work alone, in violation of the law, how is that trainee's work supposed to be evaluated by the supervising conductor to see if the work is being done in accordance to all rules and guidelines and whatever? There's no way that can happen if the person is not there actually supervising the work. And there's also another issue, they count all these trips. What counts as a trip that requires an evaluation? Can you really provide any type of much of an evaluation? Let's say that you're on what's called a speed. These are trains that have high priority. And so the conductor trainee basically gets on at the rail yard. And if it's a speed train, they may not do any work in the yard, before they get on the train. And so, and the other thing is, engines can also be fairly constrained as far as how much room there is there. The conductor and the locomotive engineer can sit in there fine. But when there's a third and sometimes even a fourth person, what happens is the conductor trainee may end up in a second unit, a second locomotive. So if you have a speed and you basically just get on and you get off at the other end, how much actual work have you done that can be evaluated? Basically nothing. What if you're on a trip where you're in a locomotive, in a separate locomotive, and basically nobody's with you, but there's no place for you to sit in the main locomotive, and so you could be riding on some locomotive, you could even be riding backwards or in the dark. Are you getting evaluated? Is that a trip worth evaluating if, it's a speed and you're not getting anything that you're actually doing as a conductor trainee? So there needs to be a lot more thought given into what counts as an actual trip and what might just be another familiarization trip. Even that wouldn't even count to me as familiarization. What can you see if you're sitting in a locomotive in the dark and maybe even running a locomotive that's backwards? What are you being familiarized with? So there are several issues here that pertain to proper evaluation for conductor trainees or even locomotive trainees for that matter. Um, so, what's a valuable field evaluation? On trips like that, to me, those would be worthless. A conductor trainee, in my opinion, probably shouldn't even be on those trains because they're not doing anything. They're just along for the ride. So, yeah, if it's daylight, maybe you could be familiarizing yourself with the route. But if you're in an engine that's going back and you're running backwards because the engine's facing the other way and the main locomotive is the one that's driving the train, again, are you being familiarized if everything you're seeing is just stuff coming back? You're looking backwards as the train's moving on? How well can you familiarize yourself with the territory? Probably not that much. So these are the types of issues that, really play into all of this. And what I did receive were 4 PMRC evaluation sheets for conductor trainee Jason Clooney. Only 4. Done for a conductor trainee who would have completed at least 57 tours prior to his death. He was close to having 60. He had 57 tours on the line prior to his death. Yet only 4 of those had been PMRC'd from what I was given. And he had 44 evaluations done. So yet trainees are required to know 65 required tasks. So, and you would think if they were required tasks that those would have to be PMRC'd. But, there's huge issues here, right? On how many of the 65 required tasks are trainees actually PMRC'd? That's a huge question. And, I'm going to give you, radio communications is just a hugely important issue when it comes to the rail industry. And as we discussed that and how there was that attempted rewrite for the Canadian rail operating rules, this is another issue I'm going to be discussing. But anyway, in the case of my child, the first year that my child was in the rail industry, my child was PMRC'd for radio communications over 300 times. Wow, that's amazing. So are they doing that because they want to fire you? Or are they doing that because, geez, this person was bored at that particular terminal and they just like to listen in on all the conversations to make sure everybody was using the proper communications? And proper communications in the rail industry are very strict and very specific in terms of how these people communicate with each other as they're doing their work. And so my child had been PMRC'd just on communications. My child was told that they'd been PMRC'd over 300 times in about a year without their knowledge, because they don't know when somebody is listening in to the radio communications and they're being PMRC'd. So, okay, if, we can have one person PMRC'd 300 times, what about all the other tasks? What about, somebody who's not in a yard who might be out of range from the, the train master? Who's PMRCing people who are doing all these road trips? So there's a lot of issues here is all I'm trying to say. And people that are not familiar with the rail industry need to understand that these issues are out there, because you can't address the issues unless you understand the issues. So that's why I try and bring some of this stuff to light for you. Okay, so this is what the form for PMRCs looks like. And you can see at the bottom there where I have the red arrows where it says Jason Clooney. I blanked out the names of the other crew members that were on those trips with him. But anyway, this is kind of what the form looks like. It tells you the train, the time, the routes, that type of stuff. And the few categories that are provided there on what they were evaluated on. But, when you look at the categories here, there's no way that this even comes close to 65 tasks that are being PMRC'd here. So, again, that's another issue. Okay, on this particular PMRC sheet for conductor trainee Jason Clooney, I noticed something rather interesting here. And that's the fact, if you look at the arrow there in the middle, that this was a special train for the CEO of CN Rail at the time, and that would have been Claude Mongeau. Claude Mongeau would go on to become a member of the board at Norfolk Southern, and he would then become chairman of the board at Norfolk Southern. And that's where you had Norfolk Southern is the company that was involved in the East Palestine, Ohio train derailment. And Claude Mongeau, in early June, stepped down as chairman of the board at Norfolk Southern. He said it was for personal reasons. He had stepped down at CN for personal reasons too, but then he went back into the rail industry. I think he had an issue. I think he did have a health issue that had to do with throat cancer or something. But anyways, he did go back, to work for several boards and several companies. And he recently did, again, step down on June 3rd. Was that because he had health issues? He says it was. Or he didn't say health issues. He just said personal reasons was the reason he stepped down. I don't know. Could it be because there's a little bit of pressure being applied? Because there's a whole lot of people that know that all of these disclosures are about to happen. And we're talking high up people. We're talking the Trump administration itself. J.D. Vance, who is from Ohio, and he got at least 2,500 incriminating pages from me. And it's such a small world. My nephew's brother-in-law worked for J.D. Vance before he became Trump's running mate. So what a small world. Anyway, and I believe J.D. Vance may have also been at my nephew's wedding. When I didn't even go to my nephew's wedding during COVID. So my sister was pretty sure that's who was there. But anyway, my nephew married into a pretty politically active family. But anyway, so in this particular PMRC, you've got CEO Claude Mongeau, who was actually on a train with conductor trainee Jason Clooney about a month prior to his death. So again, on this PMRC, you can see here that the CEO of CN Rail, Claude Mongeau, was himself on this particular train along with conductor trainee Jason Clooney. But here's what the comments also say on this particular PMRC. It says, crew of Hall and Sova were 100% compliant to all rules observed, and then in brackets, as it was highly expected. Okay, so we put some of our best on the train here for this trip that was going to have the CEO on it. And then on this PMRC, I guess they just were supposed to be PMRCing what? Just the engineer and the conductor? I don't think so. What about comments pertaining to the conductor trainee? There's none on this PMRC form, which I was given for this conductor trainee. So, it's all real nice that we put our best on the train and we're concerned about the CEO seeing that they're 100% compliant. But what about this trip being a training trip for Jason Clooney? So, to have zero comments pertaining to that trainee, if you say that the locomotive engineer and the conductor were 100% compliant with all rules, but you don't include the name of the conductor trainee, Clooney, on there. Does that not imply that maybe he wasn't compliant with all the rules observed? Why are there zero comments for the trainee on this PMRC? And this may show something else that unfortunately I think is a sad reality in the rail industry, because the frontline rail workers see so many trainees come and go. And, first of all, I would think that would be exhausting to always have to be training trainees, and they don't end up sticking around because of the churning of the workforce that happens in the rail industry. Well, the thing is, until you've been qualified and you've proven yourself in the rail industry, I don't think that cohesion as far as you being a real crew member is really there. And so you're just kind of like this person to the side, whether or not we care about you or not, you know. Um, and that too is also something I think that can be further justified by a comment once made to my child. Um, and it was a comment to the effect that a good conductor doesn't work, meaning that if they have a trainee, the trainee is expected to do all the work. So if you see a trainee basically as cheap labor to help you do your job, and I'm not saying that's the case for all of them, it isn't for sure, but definitely for some, I suspect it is, then does that explain why some of them will let you wander off and do everything on your own without supervision in violation of the law? Well, that part, of course, can be explained by the fact that neither the supervising conductor or the OJT had ever been trained in how to supervise a conductor trainee, and that came out in the Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal hearing pertaining to Jason's death. But again, it's a huge issue because, if the attitude is it's just an extra pair of hands to help me on the job, are you really going to be concerned about that person getting life-saving, critical training, especially when, they don't get that much money for the liability that, frontline rail workers incur for having a trainee under them when they go on trips? They don't get paid a whole lot of money for having these people that they have to train. And again, when it's a rolling door, like a revolving door of trainees, and it's kind of like, oh, here we go again, another one, another one, another one, I think they probably get tired of constantly having to train trainees, and they probably have the attitude these people aren't going to be sticking around anyways. They're going to end up getting fired or churned, and I don't think the blame is on the trainee, because you can't just go through thousands and thousands of trainees and none of them are really quite good enough to really stick around. We fired the bunch of them. The great majority of them are not there within a year or so. If you had really poured that much money and time and investment into your workers, wouldn't you pour in a little bit more to make sure that those things that they may have issues with, that they do get that proper training, that little extra training, so that they can do what is required of them? Because, if they're not properly trained, whose fault is that? The trainees or maybe CN Rail? So that's just my opinion on it, folks. But, given what we've seen, I think the blame is on CN Rail and, of course, Transport Canada. Okay, another issue here as far as deadly training has to do with something that's required, and that's called a job briefing. And it's required by law that when prior to the workers going out, they're supposed to get together, discuss the tasks at hand, and make sure that everybody understands what's expected of them, what they're going to be doing, whatever. So if you look at the witness statements that had to do with the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney, it was clear that there was not enough room in the main locomotive that was running the train, the front one, for conductor trainee Jason Clooney to be in there, because they had 3 other crew members that day. The locomotive engineer, who was acting as the pilot locomotive engineer, then they had the locomotive engineer who was new to the territory, and they had the supervising conductor, who were all in the main engine. And so Jason, as a conductor trainee, was sitting in another unit and basically by himself en route to this next work location, which was called Murphy's. And so the work instructions had changed that day as far as what they were supposed to do and pick up. It turned out that there were, I think, rail cars that were empties, or they were full. No, they were empties. They had to bring them back. And so they had a change in their work assignment is basically what happened. And so it was these, other crew members said that Jason, because he sat in the back engine, would come up once in a while to the main locomotive and to try and talk to these people. And that's basically, it looks like how the job briefing happened, that as the engines are rolling on by, that Jason would have been basically outside, because I can't see how you could fit that fourth person in the locomotive and give him his job briefing. So he may very well have received that job briefing while he was standing outside the main locomotive. And how much are you really going to hear as far as what's expected for you to do as a conductor trainee when you get to that next work location? So huge issue. And, unless you have the actual witnesses and crew members that were there that day, these are facts that you really can't confirm. Even in the Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal hearing, the actual on-the-ground witnesses were not even in that hearing. The only person that was there representing, the union and the workers in matters pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney was the VP from the Teamsters Canada Rail Conference. Excuse me, but you were not on the site that day. You were not there on the accident scene. Why were the real witnesses not brought in for that hearing? Could it be because maybe it would have exposed a whole lot of problems with conductor trainee training programs, or maybe a whole lot of nasty stuff would have came out, like switches that were not properly labeled, and the fact that, we were violating the law when conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed, and the fact that, there was just so many violations of so many laws, and maybe, if you bring the actual witnesses, maybe a whole lot more stuff would have come out. So that's a huge issue again. Why do you not have the actual witnesses there for the Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal hearing? And so that's why, I kind of, I have very little pity, I guess, for the Teamsters Canada Rail Conference when it comes to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. Especially since the person who was the sole witness for the rail employees, this VP from the CRC, would then go on to become like a vice chair at the Canada Industrial Relations Board. Pretty high position. And, I just can't help but wonder if Roland Hackle got that position because he played ball and helped with maybe the cover-up in matters pertaining to Jason's death at the Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal of Canada hearing. Just my humble opinion, but I think it's a valid question that needs to be asked. Why were the real witnesses not there? And then this guy that was there ends up getting a pretty nice promotion to the Canada Industrial Relations Board. Whole other issue that I'll do a separate video on, because it's the Canada Industrial Relations Board. If you remember, I don't know, many of you may not know this, but when CN and CP went on strike last year, they were forced back to work after arbitration happened via the Canada Industrial Relations Board. So, just saying, in my opinion, there's some conflicts of interest, folks, as far as, all of the players in this. And that's why I'm going to do a whole series just on the players in all of these issues. There's just so much to document. Like, I've documented it, but now to have to put it in videos also, because people just like to go home and listen to videos. It's so much easier when you're tired. And I understand that. That's fine. But these are just issues that people need to be aware of. And they are, in my opinion, quite huge issues. So, just stuff to be aware of, folks, as we keep going through these materials pertaining to deadly materials, deadly procedures in the field, because a job briefing should not be done on the fly, en route to the next work location. Um, if that's what happened, even if he was in the engine, the roar of the engine, the fact that you've got three other people in there, I mean, it's just not a situation that would be good for a good job briefing where you could make sure that everybody understood, including especially the conductor trainee. And especially in view of the fact that the supervising conductor had never been trained in how to supervise that trainee. So just some huge issues. Okay, again, in matters pertaining to deadly training in the field here, not only on note here that only on the very first of the 4 PMRC documents is there any semblance of a PMRC for switching of hand-operated switches. And that's the arrow that I have at the very bottom there. And just next to hand-operated switches, it says CN General Operating Instructions. And so, there are several steps to, flipping a switch. You have to have proper body positioning not to be injured. You have to flip the switch. You have to then check the targets and then check the points, even though that is not done at the switch itself. It is done at the rails. So, yeah, he flipped the switch and he flipped it okay. He flipped it right. Does that mean that he went on and checked the points, looking at the actual rails to make sure they're properly lined for the intended route? Just a one-liner like this doesn't exactly, confirm that the proper and complete procedure was done. So, it's a huge issue, right? So the point is, out of 58 trips, only once is there evidence of any PMRC procedures monitoring for regulatory compliance for conductor trainee Jason Clooney in matters pertaining to the proper operation of hand switches, and that PMRC is inconclusive as to any indication of having PMRC'd conductor trainee Jason Clooney in Rule 104 specifically as it pertained to checking the points for the intended route. So if he was only PMRC'd 4 times, for CN Rail to properly evaluate a trainee on 65 required tasks that must be learned prior to a trainee being qualified, it just doesn't seem like, he was PMRC'd enough if I did receive all his documentation for his PMRC activities. And on a side note here, if you look here up above, it says the transportation, qualified standards for operating crews, and this is that blue document. That is the one, hang on, that was dated, I believe, that's the one that's dated 2010. If you look at that document on page 72, there appears to be kind of an illegal definition here of what a qualified person is. And the word qualified in the rail industry refers to, you've been trained per the Railway Employee Qualification Standards regulation on all categories for which you must be trained as a qualified conductor, 6 of those categories which are found in Appendix 14 of the SOR 87-150 regulation, which is in the process of being overhauled by Transport Canada. But the word qualified person has a very specific meaning in the rail industry. And to be using these words in training sessions with people who are extremely new to the rail industry, for example, conductor trainees, puts in their mind the fact that you may be qualified according to this. It's a person who, because of their knowledge, training, or experience, that word "or" is a huge problem. But anyways, let me finish reading it. Is qualified to perform a duty safely and properly. And then it says, for example, a certified car inspector is qualified to inspect and maintain car brake equipment. And then it says next, there's a semicolon, and it says, train crews are qualified to inspect brake equipment. Really? I don't think that your average conductor or locomotive engineer would argue that they've really been qualified to inspect braking equipment for a train the way that a certified car inspector, and a car here, they're talking about a rail car. They're not talking about an automotive vehicle. They're talking about a rail car. So, if you're certified in car inspections, that means you've had the knowledge, the training, and I would argue, and experience, not or. To have an or there opens a whole nasty door, because companies like CN, they also hire contractors, or they can put managers at the controls. Oh, wait a minute, is the manager really a qualified person? You may have been given a little training class, but if you haven't passed the qualification test, and we're going to get into, that's a whole other video series, managers at the controls. There's just so much, folks. But basically, if you look at what qualified means for Transport Canada versus what's actually happening in the field, I think the argument could definitely be made that when you've got managers at the controls, they are not qualified. Based on this definition, they would be maybe qualified. But are they? This or is a huge, huge problem. And I don't know who put this document together, Transportation Qualification Standards for Operating Crews. It says CN on top of the copy that I have, but was this put together maybe by Transport Canada or by the Railway Association of Canada? I don't know. But this definition is a huge problem, because I could sit in every class, okay, and get all the knowledge for being a qualified conductor. I'm really brain heavy, man. I know it all, right? Does that mean I'm a qualified person? No. You have to have the training in the field and the experience to be a qualified conductor. That's why even after they get their field training, conductor trainees are then on a 6-month probation period to make sure they get the experience they need to be considered truly qualified. But anyways, so that or, I don't know who came up with this definition, but in law, I think this one could be argued in court. And when I used to be in Chicago, my lawyer would try and convince me to go into law, because when I'd be doing some of his cases for him, typing them up, I was just a temp, while I was looking for a job in my field of finance. And this lawyer taught me so much. He used to always try to convince me to go into law. And, I would tell him, hey, Lou, would you go back into law? And, he would have to honestly say, no, because you have to defend people are guilty. And it's your job to get them off if you're a public defendant and whatever. And so, but anyways, he used to tell me, because one time I had caught something in one of his briefs, and it was just one word. But that one word made all the difference in the case. And I had studied technical writing to the master's level. And so there are certain things that stick out for me. And this or is one of those things. It's one of those things on which I think you can spin an entire legal case on, that or. And so my lawyer, he used to say, you should really go into law because you have a very rare ability. You can spin an entire case on one word. And I'm going to tell you, in matters pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney, I think there's one case where I can spin the entire case on one letter of the alphabet. And so a thing like this, are you qualified just because you're brain heavy and you got the knowledge, the book knowledge? No. I don't think that the average person would agree that you would be a qualified conductor just because you have knowledge. You have to have the training, the experience in the field, and you have to have undergone testing, proper testing to ensure that your knowledge is accurate. You may have a lot of knowledge and geez, it may not be accurate. Are you qualified? You know, this is a huge question and one that this is the kind of question and the kind of documentation that lawyers love. So that's all I'm going to say on this one. And we're going to keep going. Okay, what we have here is it's called Appendix B, and this was taken from a railway investigation report that dated back to 2007, and it had to do with that particular incident had to do with a remote locomotive operations incident in Mac Yard outside of Toronto at a CN rail yard. And this was page 29 of that report. And this was the incident which had back then launched an attempt to totally overhaul the railway employee qualification standards regulations having to do with training programs for frontline rail employees. What would turn out, in my opinion, to be a complete and total public scam. And we're going to get into that issue as far as that. After this series is completed, I'll get into those issues. But anyways, this form came from that railway investigation report, and it showed the 65 tasks on which rail workers were supposed to be evaluated in the field. So the key words there were supposed to be evaluated on these 65 things. But per the information I obtained via the Freedom of Information and the Office of the Information Commissioner of Canada, CN had provided documentation pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney, that their conductor training program had really not been changed since the original filing with Transport Canada. Really? When was that original filing? Could it be as far back as 2001 when the Railway Association of Canada created its own conductor training program? Is that what CN was using? When exactly was that original filing? And why had CN Rail not updated its own conductor training program with Transport Canada, especially given all the changes to the conductor training program that were apparently illegally implemented at CN Rail. These are shown on page 11 and 12 of Jason's accident report. And, you know, again, the Railway Safety Act, sections 18 and 19, absolutely state that any changes to railway employee training programs are first supposed to be filed with Transport Canada for proper approval and review prior to field implementation. And the fact that, you know, Transport Canada is trying to overhaul the Railway Employee Qualification Standards regulation, well, guess what? Until you overhaul the Railway Safety Act and change that act, as far as the requirements for changes to training programs, the act overrides the regulation. And so, change your regulation or not, the act overrides. And that means programs, changes to training programs must be changed, must be filed first with Transport Canada for proper review and approval prior to field implementation. You don't get to just implement your programs and then file paperwork with Transport Canada within 90 days to let us know that these changes have happened per the Railway Employees Standard Regulation, which, and that's a section 19.2, which and that's what that says, that you just need to file your changes with Transport Canada. Oh, wait a minute, that might be what the regulation says, but the Act overrides the regulation. And the Act says any changes to training programs must first be filed and approved by Transport Canada prior to field implementation. So that's a huge issue, folks. But anyways, at the time of his death, this is just a sample form, by the way, that was taken from that investigation report dating back to 2007. And at the time of his death, though, conductor trainee Jason Clooney had 58, that he was on his 58 of 60 required trips. He was supposed to have 45 trips on the line, I believe, and 15 yard trips. And so, but he had 0 yard training. So if he was being qualified that day, again, huge issue, would have been fake qualified, just like my own child had been qualified with 0 yard training. And again, we need to have the release of the last 5 pages of the conductor witness statement in order to know whether or not maybe Jason was being fake qualified the day he was killed. So of the trips that he had completed, 14 evaluations were missing. About 25% of his evaluations. But some of those that were there indicated that he had problems with switching activities and with working alone. And that's, again, in the Transportation Safety Board Railway Investigation Report R13W0260 pertaining to Jason's death. Now, and we covered that in several videos, pertaining to that report. And that's all under the brainwashing video series. So in spite of all of this, there are some, again, who knew of conductor trainee Jason Clooney and who definitely said that the rumor was that he was being qualified the day he was killed, in spite of having 0 yard training. So again, that would not surprise me given my own child was fake qualified at CN Rail. Now, if you look at this actual sample conductor training evaluation form here, it says under switches, where the 2 red arrows are, proper body mechanics. So, a switch can be pretty hard to turn. And so you have to make sure that you're standing properly in order not to, injure your back or whatever. So they look at proper body mechanics, and then uses 2 hands. So you have to use both hands when you're flipping the switch. And then it says checks switch points, but it doesn't say for what. And again, if you remember in a previous video, when this survey was done by the health and safety officer asking, what do you check points for? A lot of people were answering to make sure it's free of ice. Wrong answer. On here, you've got check the targets and the route to be used. And again, the targets is a sign. It would be like the label and whatever on top of the switch itself. But again, that's not what you need to be checking to check the points, or for the intended route, because that switch can malfunction. What if the targets don't move properly? Let's say they're I don't know, you can still flip the switch, but what if the target, is rusted out or whatever, and they don't turn properly with the switch when it's aligned or realigned? You shouldn't be checking, in my opinion, the target at the top of the switch. You should be checking the actual points where the rails actually meet, and not for ice, for the intended route. So there's a lot of issues with things like this as far as them being deadly training materials, because they're not putting the emphasis in the proper place as far as why you check the points, where you do it, and when. So all these are issues, again, that people need to be aware of. Okay, so this concludes part 5 of deadly trading materials. So again, like, share, subscribe, let other people know about this website. And you can go on my website called railfamiliesunited.com, and you'll see all the videos are posted there that I've done so far. And you will also see under, there's a donator help tab also, where you can help donate to my work. Or a very simple way to help is to print. I did a 1-page, it's kind of like little business cards that you can just print off any printer, cut them up, and hand them out to people, so that if you're a person who has an interest in the rail industry, if you're a frontline rail worker, get the word out, let people know about the website and about these videos. I'll also be posting them, on YouTube and whatever, but for now they're on my website. But YouTube's coming. So again, like, share, subscribe, and let people know. And I will see you on the next one, part 6.